Anita Allen from University of Pennsylvania.
Thank you. It is quite an honor to be here today. My paper is Mental Disorders and the System of Judgmental Responsibility. People who might otherwise be ethically and morally responsible are compromised by several fundamental things, Dworkin says. Self-interest, of course, being pulled in two directions at once, which Dworkin calls moral schizophrenia, and by failing to apply applicable principles across to all categories of reflection, what he calls moral compartmentalization. People who might otherwise act responsibly are also compromised by the conditions popularly and imprecisely referred to as mental disease, mental illness, mental disorder, being crazy, insanity. The percentage of people in the US assigned one of these labels at some point in life is strikingly large. It is surprising then that moral philosophers do not have more to say descriptively, analytically, or normatively about the moral lives and responsibilities, the ethical lives and responsibilities of persons affected by mental illnesses, mental conditions. Like most philosophers of moral and ethical responsibility, Dworkin concentrates on normal adult men and women. However, in Chapter 10 of Justice for Hedgehogs, Dworkin seems to take a special interest in psychiatric pathology. Dworkin draws numerous contrasts between normal adults and people who fall in other categories, including children, that's not a pathology, children, idiots, Dworkin's term, not mine, the brain damaged, the insane, and psychopaths. Now, modern philosophers often seem to assume that people with serious mental disorders lack ethical and moral capacity, and because of it, they lack moral or legal capacity, culpability. But philosophers rarely bother to precisely define who counts as having the sort of mental conditions that undercut moral capacity. And even when philosophers acknowledge ethical and moral capacity among people affected by mental conditions, they then fail to incorporate the varieties of ethical and moral engagement common to mental disorder into their accounts of normative life. At any given moment in America's mentally troubled community, people are visibly integrated into the fabric of society. They're there, we're there. They function, we function as participants in the ethics of care, concern, and practical responsibility. It's worth considering, therefore, whether the fact that Dworkin is writing in an era of heightened awareness of the pervasiveness of mental disorders and intellectual disabilities makes a difference in the way he conceptualizes judgmental responsibility. And I took that question with me to his text. Does it make a difference that he's writing this year and not, say, 20 years ago? Well, all of you in this room know the literature. People with mental conditions are stock characters in moral philosophy. They are dramatis personae with bit roles. They are brought into the story as specimens to make a point, not to be part of the conversation. Philosophers typically introduce people with mental conditions at the point in laying down a moral theory when they believe they must acknowledge that there are, unfortunately, exceptions to the otherwise proud and universal ascription of moral responsibility to adult members of the human family. Does Justice for Hedgehogs follow this regrettable pattern? People affected by mental conditions first appear in Chapter 10. Free Will and Responsibility, the chapter in which Dworkin focuses on the proper ascription of a dimension of living well and being good that he refers to as judgmental responsibility, the chapters that have been discussed by Professors Kane and Tim Scanlon before me. Judgmental responsibility, as they point out, is an ethical and moral capacity. Someone has judgmental responsibility for an act, Dworkin says, if it is appropriate to hold him responsible for it, to blame him for it, to praise him for it. Judgmental responsibility is, it seems, part of the freedom, reason, or feeling package philosophers traditionally refer to as moral agency. Judgmental responsibility is something Dworkin wants badly to ascribe to as many people as possible, to dignify them, to motivate them, but he implicitly assumes certain marginal populations stand in his way. So he puzzles over the exceptions, as he refers to the idiots, the psychopaths, and the seriously insane. How can anyone, sane or insane, be responsible for their actions if those actions are not free but determined by forces beyond their control? The discipline of moral philosophy has established a drill. Before a philosopher can ascribe moral and legal responsibility to individuals, he or she must first prove that either the individuals possess freedom of will or that freedom of will doesn't matter. Accordingly, in a big book about living well, Dworkin could be expected to tackle the classic free will versus determinism problem before advancing the conception of ethical and moral responsibility, and so he does. As you've been hearing, Dworkin argues that neither determinism nor epiphenomenalism is a personal responsibility showstopper. We can meaningfully ascribe judgmental responsibility to normal men and women, and to many of the youth and people with mental disorders, even if determinism and epiphenomenalism are scientifically true. His argument relies on his trademark interpretive turn. For Dworkin, judgmental responsibility is an interpretive concept whose point and value is relevant to the understanding and application of the term. Embracing judgmental responsibility is a better ethical fit with the overall fabric of our lives than rejecting it on account of scientific determinism or epiphenomenalism. A responsibility system, he says, exists in our lives, and we must try to justify it as well as we can. You've already heard what that system ascribes to us. We have responsibility if we have a minimal ability to form true beliefs about the world, about other people's mental states, and the likely consequences of what they do. And we also have this capacity if we have the ability to decide and make decisions that fit into our normative personalities. These are the epistemic and regulative capacities required, respectively. Now, Dworkin's account of judgmental responsibility, his adverbial ethics, as he calls it, shifts towards the narrative, the internal, the creative, and away from the executive, the causal, the hydraulic. This is good news for moral philosophers looking for a normative moral framework within which to explain why and in what way people with mental illnesses belong to the universe of moral agents. People with symptoms of bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety, obsessive-compulsive disorder, dissociative identity disorder, schizophrenia, and the like are creative actors. They are narrative builders. They are intelligent. They are not robots. They are not people, the kind of people Dworkin indelicately terms idiots, who don't know that guns can kill. Yet the narratives of responsibility shaping Dworkin's interpretation of responsible actors within the responsibility system that he says culture hands down are narratives of mental wellness, not narratives of mental illness or disorder. Where are the narratives of mental unwellness in the story? Now, mental disorders are not a marginal phenomenon, meriting a parenthetical or a footnote in ethics books. There can be no adequate ethical theory, I would argue, of moral agency or of judgmental responsibility that omits a perspective on the moral ethical capacities and responsibilities of people affected by mental disorders. When should we blame? What's an excuse? What, if anything, is the obligation of a person who has harmed on account of mental illness? Philosophers have plenty of work to do in order to answer these questions before getting on to the questions of ideal legal responsibility. Suppose a well-educated and gainfully employed adult storms into a friend's apartment during an episode of bipolar rage and smashes a framed artwork to the floor and assaults the friend with a shard of glass. Should he or she blame his behavior critically? Should he or she judge himself at all? Now, following Dworkin, the offender is judgmentally responsible if he or she has the capacity to recognize truth, comprehend consequences, and act in accordance with normative personality. The adult who has a bipolar rage attack is someone who probably satisfies the epistemic prong of judgmental responsibility, but not on the occasion of the attack, the regulative prong. We can imagine, though, that overwhelmingly the person does act in accord with his normative personality, sufficient for judgmental responsibility, the regulative prong. She could be like Kay Jamison, the successful bipolar doctor at Hopkins, or like Ellen Sachs, the schizophrenic law professor who just won the MacArthur Genius Award. It may be tempting to understand judgmental responsibility as a matter of development or degree, and yet judgmental responsibility has another axis, a distinctly episodic phenomenon axis. It's a trait that can come and go. The set can come and go rapidly, and rapidly and frequently, as it does in the case of people with rapid cycling bipolar disorder, or it can come and go occasionally, as it might for people with affective disorders that are well treated by medication, lifestyle, and therapy. The ideal moral agent will avoid lying and cheating and stealing and promise breaking and unfairness, injustice, abuse, and violence. Histories of psychiatry revel in accounts of this kind of behavior. But what I'm trying to argue today, and I don't have enough time to completely play this out, but what I'm arguing today is simply that there are many people who are with mental disorders who are high functioning, who are teaching school, who may have lives that are so affected by mental disorder, they have to take multiple medications and be hospitalized quite frequently. Nonetheless, they are school teachers, they are lawyers, they are judges, they have to count in the universe of moral personality, in the universe of moral agency. So I would just recommend that anyone, including Dworkin, who looks at the question of responsibility, include these narratives within their work. And it's not just a matter of saying, there, but for the grace of God go I. We have to also say, there, despite the grace of God, I am. Thank you.